EA might be one of the most hated companies in the gaming world for many reasons. Every hater can share dozens of reasons which we can agree with most or all of them. But just like any other company, we still have to admire some of their work, something that most people may not pay attention to or may not consider important. Don't be misled by the video you're seeing now, it's just for the introduction. The main point is, when it comes to Battlefield, we have got to think twice. If you have already watched some of my videos, you already know that I'm not talking about the multiplayer. Definitely not. I'm talking about the single player, the story mode, the campaign. Why is it an exception? That's what we're going to find out after you grab a cold beer. Ready? Let's go. Every time we talk about World War II games, what do you remember? Stalingrad, Normandy, Stalingrad, D-Day, Normandy, Stalingrad, D-Day. Anything else? I don't think. Back in 2006, the year that marked my first experience playing Call of Duty, I thought that the war was between four factions: Germany, UK, USA, and the Soviet Union. Other countries, as I thought, were just living in peace watching the whole world burning. Of course, that wasn't the case, but at that time it was my understanding of World War II. The deeper I went in gaming world, the more I started to realize that other nations also took part in the war, thanks to who? To EA. And the war wasn't only in Europe, but also in Africa, in Asia, and in some parts of South America. How many games about World War II took place in Stalingrad or Omaha Beach? How many games discussed the siege of Stalingrad or Roosevelt's speech as the Allied troops landed on the beach of Normandy? First-person shooter like Call of Duty or strategy games like Company of Heroes all talked about the same places. The first time I saw France taking part in the war was when I played Medal of Honor Underground. Wait, did France really take part in the war? Surprisingly for me, yes it did. The game really opened my eyes that France was occupied and there was indeed French resistance. How about other nations? Well, Italians also took part in the war, on the side of the Allies. Thanks to Mafia 2, I knew that the Sicilians took part in the war as a part of their time they had to spend in jail. We are talking about games that either are more than 20 years old or games that were not meant to be World War II, because other games talked about the very same places. Those too few ones weren't as well known as the others. Yes, Call of Duty 2 had multiple missions in the desert in France. Company of Heroes 3 took place in other parts of Europe, Italy for example. But what was the problem? The problem is that those missions are either a short part of the whole campaign like Call of Duty World War II, and remember, Call of Duty 2 is an exception. All these missions were added as DLCs. Even when they tried to create a game dedicated to other fronts like Company of Heroes 3, we couldn't actually see a big difference in gameplay, only some minor visual improvements, which could be a separate DLC. So yes, when they had to make a full game, they made a DLC, and when they had to make only a DLC, they made a full game. Yes, it does mean that other parts of the world weren't mentioned in games. Of course they are. And of course they were. But compare them to the games in Normandy and Stalingrad regarding the numbers and you will see the huge gap. Now back to Battlefield, and remember, I'm talking only about the campaign. Discussed the war from different perspectives. And here I'll be talking about Battlefield 5 as it took place during the Second World War. I'll discuss the First World War in another video. Battlefield 5 discussed the war in Norway, went very cold, talked about what people did in order to defend their country. Missions behind enemy lines, ordinary people, not British or American intelligence or special operations. They did a decent job when they had to warm up now and then before moving to the next destination. Discuss the stories of African people who fought for France and yet were forgotten, despite paying in blood for France, but their skin color didn't help getting their gratitude and appreciation for what they had done and the sacrifice they had to pay only because they were black. How they represented the underdog, how they used that as a motivation to fight even harder to prove that they weren't less courageous than any other white male. When we went to Germany, we learned about the old people, and when I say old, they might be in their late 20s, who experienced war and who knew what fake propaganda could do to the fresh blood that joined the army at the end of the war. The brainwash those kids were exposed to. We saw Germans as people who knew, at least in the last stages of the war, that they were cheated on and they were victims of lies. They were portrayed as normal people, not savages who knew that it was wrong. Yet, they were still soldiers and they had orders to follow till the last moment. How many of these scenes have you seen in video games? Again, I'm not saying that Battlefield 5 presented something that no other game has ever presented. No, I'm not saying that. I'm only comparing what other games presented and how they presented them, and what Battlefield presented and how it did that. That's why, when it comes to campaigns and single player, EA games that talk about world wars from a personal point of view are on the top of the list, and no other game has, so far, presented what Battlefield 5 presented the same way EA did. Yeah, I know there were some games that discussed Japan, for example Call of Duty World at War, or even Battlefield 5, but World at War, it was one of only few, and for Battlefield 5, the Japanese campaign was a DLC, and it was only online. I couldn't find it as a campaign or single player. I'd really like to play a war game from the Romanian perspective, for example, or the Ukrainians who joined the Germans and then had to switch teams, or the Arabs' resistance in Africa and the Middle Eastern resistance against the French and the British. I'm really tired of D-Day and Stalingrad, and I hope other theaters of war become under the spotlight. Until then, I can only hope that you like the video. Feel free to share what you think and what other war theaters you would like to see in the future, but only about World War II, as this video focuses only on that era. Next video will be about World War I, and that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching and see you later in another video.